Each Monday, as I said, we hear from the former Premier of Queensland, Campbell Newman. In light of the legitimate allegations of cruelty, emotional brutality and the complete lack of compassion in the refusal to allow people, grieving families, to enter Queensland, but at the same time constantly using the personal pronoun I this and I that, this merits a closer look at this Dr. Jeannette Young. The heavily unqualified Dr. Young is quite prepared to grant exemptions to sporting codes, entertainment stars and billionaires to skip quarantine, as in locked up in a hotel room. The argument being they bring, that's what she said, a lot of money to the state. But then, piling contradiction on contradiction, she sought to argue that, quote, health considerations come first. In the statement on Friday, peppered with the use of the vertical pronoun I, she was callously unsympathetic, except for the sporting and entertainment stars. Annastacia Palaszczuk, the Premier, has been criticised ruthlessly up and down the country. It appears now that Palaszczuk's greatest weakness is her belated understanding of what happened when she let this epidemiologically unqualified Chief Health Officer loose with a declaration of a public health emergency. Now, this point's not been made anywhere. This occurred last Saturday week, September 5 at 1 a.m, posted the day before September 4, where I, Dr. Jeannette Young, quote, reasonably believe it's necessary to give the following directions, pursuant to the powers under Section 362B of the Public Health Act 2005, unquote. And this declaration of a public health emergency included, indeed was predominantly about border restrictions. Now, here we go. Part 4 of the declaration, para 23, clearly states, quote, only the Chief Health Officer or Deputy Chief Health Officer can exempt a person from entering quarantine as required under this direction, unquote. And the 18-page declaration invests this Dr. Young with extraordinary powers and definitions that obviously no person in the Palaszczuk government, until it was too late, only after Palaszczuk had been belted from one end of the country to the other, clearly no one had a clue about the powers of this Jeannette Young. Apparently, belatedly, someone has told Premier Palaszczuk that she doesn't have the power to overrule, as in Part 4 of this Border Restrictions Direction. To be precise, Border Restrictions Direction number 13, which I have in front of me. It's clear that this person, the Chief Health Officer, Dr. Jeannette Young, is the only person who can grant an exemption. So on borders and quarantine and exemptions, Annastacia Palaszczuk is not running the state. I wonder if Campbell Newman had copped this. Let's go to Campbell. Good evening to you, Campbell. What do you make of that?
Well, Alan, I certainly wouldn't have copped it if I was Premier, and I think the whole approach, as you know from previous times I've been on this program, is dead wrong from one side of the country to the other. Look, we've given Dr. Young extraordinary powers, and something has to give. And really, the government's got to reassert control. Palaszczuk had a terrible week politically last week. She looked callous. She looked uncaring. She also looked impotent, and that's not a good look when you're a political leader. But I do point out, Alan, it's clearly just reviewing that Public Health Act that specific COVID-19 amendments have been made this year. So they wheeled legislation that was originally put up in 2005 and put in specific COVID-19 amendments. So if they did it then to,
that's right,
have appropriate powers and controls, they can claw back something from Dr. Young and perhaps have some scrutiny over her actions and decisions.
Good on you, good call. And what about this bloke who's the president of the AMA, Queensland president, obviously a lefty, telling people to not criticise Dr. Young? She's doing her best, apparently. He says she's doing a good job. What's the definition of out of touch, Campbell?
The AMAQ are out of touch with reality. I mean, just something that'll further infuriate you and our viewers, Alan, would be going back about a year or so ago, the AMAQ was saying that climate change was a health emergency. But I'll come back to the issue at hand. Yes, on the weekend they were out backing Dr. Young. They seem to forget that the Chief Health Officer has actually said there's no need for the sort of border controls and restrictions. This is the Federal Chief Health Officer. So that's been backed. We've got all sorts of criticisms around the country from highly qualified, highly skilled and experienced medicos who have a different view to Dr. Young, and obviously by definition then AMAQ.
But you made a very good point.
Should really...
You made a very good point last week, Campbell, when you said this is just advice. It's the elected political leaders who then decide whether to accept that advice or not. We don't have leaders, we've got followers. Every time some of these health officers speak up, it's accepted with biblical truth.
Look, you know, Dr. Young does not have the wisdom of Solomon. She's not come down from the mountain like Moses with the 10 Commandments on those tablets. You know, she might have skills, but they're not sort of in the area of papal infallibility. So it is right and it is proper that should be questioned. By the way, it is not right or proper that should be subject to trolling or vile abuse or even death threats, which is now being claimed by the government. That is absolutely reprehensible, but it is right that she be held to account and her team be held to account, because they've made all sorts of wacky decisions. And, you know, I was absolutely gobsmacked. I literally watched the press conference where she said, oh, yes, but certain people are bringing in economic,
bring money to the state.
Opportunity to the state. Well, what about all the people that Dr. Young's crushing? What about, you know, allowing, you know, funerals to take place in Mackay because that was on cultural grounds, but prohibiting a 4-plane flyover on Anzac Day? We've said these things before, Alan, but it's, you know, it's right and proper that they be criticised, be held to account, because they are burning down the economy of Queensland while they're supposedly protecting us.
Campbell, what about the demise of representative government? I mean, voters elect politicians to govern them. I haven't seen Dr. Jeannette Young's name on a ballot paper.
No, and that is, pardon me, that's a big issue at the moment. But as I sort of alluded before, Premier Palaszczuk had a very bad week. And, you know, there's polling around now that shows that she was losing ground already. But, you know, my sense of it, and, I've been a critic of Frecklington and the LNP about how well they're going with their campaign. I desperately want them to win, of course, but I've been critical, but I can tell you now, last week was a watershed. Frecklington did very well on this issue about prosecuting in a calm and deliberate and measured way, and the Premier had no answers. And I think the light bulb moment was there for all Queenslanders, Alan. People were going, hang on, this is really cruel. This is intransigent stuff. Today the Premier's sort of, I think it's not just doubling down, she's sort of probably tripled down, where she's saying, well, essentially she's using the Chris Bowen line. It's my paraphrase, it's almost like, vote us out if you don't like our COVID-19 regulations.
Yes,
well, I can tell you now,
I'm saving lives.
Is where, that is actually, well, I think that's where it's going, Alan. I really do. Frecklington has the ability to pull this off.
Yeah, just a quick moment before you go on polls. There is one poll today that sort of says 47% of voters think Labor will be returned to power and only 15% expected the LNP to win. What do you make of that?
Well, that's certainly where the expectation has been. But if the LNP and Deb Frecklington can continue to point out how crazy these restrictions are, how they're damaging Queensland businesses and our long-term economic prospects, and paint that picture that it's our young people particularly going to suffer. They're the ones who'll pay higher taxes. They're the ones who will see, you know, many hopes and dreams and aspirations being smashed. So if they can prosecute that for the next 45 or so days, they can win this election. And that polling from the Australian Institute of Progress, which was in the Courier Mail today, also shows, I think, that the tide is turning against the Palaszczuk government.
I think that's true. And it should be. And so it should be. I mean, you oughtn't to be able to get away with the callous indifference that was shown last week to grieving families. That is, I can't believe any human being, let alone a politician.
Oh, it's just extraordinary, Alan. And,
could behave
and then we had the spectacle of the Deputy Premier coming out in a tantrum of a rant on the weekend, having to go at the Prime Minister for merely being an advocate. Merely being an advocate against this madness.
No, not on. Good to talk to you, Campbell. Always good to talk to you. See you next week.
Great to talk to you,
There
Alan.
he is, Campbell Newman.